Okay, all right, so, and I'm gonna turn off my video so it goes full screen. All righty, so it is March 2018, and so what I thought I would go over today, just in case there are no questions, but please feel free to chat in any questions or unmute yourself, and of course I love for this to be interactive. I only mute you because that keeps the recording clean. But I'm gonna talk a little bit about, I guess I'll do a quick review. It's always helpful, right? So what I like to talk about is when we evaluate aEEG, we're really looking at the overall background pattern. But then once we get past the background, we're really starting to look for some other features, some more distinguishing features of aEEG. So sleep, symmetry, stability, seizures, and artifact. And last time we went through these in a fair amount of detail, so I won't repeat that. But what I wanted to do today is just take a little bit of a deeper dive around sleep, because I think this is one of those features that I think we just, we say, oh, it's continuous with sleep-wake cycles, or it's discontinuous sleep-wake cycles. And I think sometimes it gets a little bit lost. Oh, there's a little comment here, so let me make sure. Okay, so we will, so go ahead and feel free to take screenshots and stuff. I don't usually post up these slides, so if you want to do that, feel free. So sleep-wake cycling, so this is what we're going to chat about today, and I love this little picture of the brain with these little Z's next to it, and really until the 1950s when we really started to understand that the brain is actually active during sleep. I think people used to just think that the brain was either on or off. And then until they started doing really sleep research and EEG came to be available to us, we really didn't know what was going on with the brain. And so now we know that the brain goes through several different kinds of cycling. And just for simplification for today, we're going to talk about REM versus non-REM. And one of the reasons why I think we really love aEEG in the NICU is because we've always had this question in our mind of, when my baby's eyes are closed, are they sleeping? Which stage of sleep are they in? And when we used aEEG and realized that we could begin to see these differentiations between the patterns and beginning to pick up on this sleep-wake cycling, I think it was super exciting for us, at least for me. I think it's super exciting. So what I want to do is really think about, why is aEEG so valuable? Well, the first off is probably just an accidental reason, which is the algorithm that they used to publish the aEEG band, right? They're putting it on that semi-logarithmic, that scale, right? So 0 to 10 is linear, 10 to 100 is logarithmic on the paper, which means that we can see so much happening in those lower voltages. And for our babies, those differentiations between continuous activity and discontinuous activity is happening at very, very, very small changes in microvolts. And because aEEG gives so much detail between 0 and 10, we can see these differences between continuous activity and discontinuous activity so easily. And again, the time compression, since sleep cycles happen over long periods of time, the compression is really a beautiful thing, because we can see that change over 30 minutes, over 60 minutes, over 90 minutes, and then over 3 hours, right? So this is why I think aEEG for capturing sleep is so important. And it's just kind of a lucky coincidence that A, our babies spend time in low voltage, and B, they chose to create a device that compressed so much those lower bandwidths. So aEEG easily captures two major background patterns, continuous activity and discontinuous activity, which is basically, as we cycle between those, is really seeing, or what we see as cycling on there is really a transition between these normal patterns for babies as they go through sleep cycles. So it's really just that luckiness of the device. So why do we even care about sleep? Number one, it's a clue towards maturation and organization of the brain. It can give us some clues towards injury and function. So I think it gives us a lot more than just a yes-no answer. So let's talk first about maturation. So these are all pictures of very, very preterm babies having their aEEG recorded. And what we can see here is that the very preterm baby has a background pattern of discontinuous in all behavioral states. So do they have variability in their lower margin? Yes, but they are always less than 5. So especially as they are very, very young. And so discontinuous is really anytime we begin to see the lower margin less than 5. That 5 is that cutoff for continuous versus discontinuous. So when we're talking about continuity, the lower margin has to be either greater than 5 or less than 5. Above 5, continuous. Below 5, discontinuous. As the age increases, the amount of time, so the percentage of time, whether you kind of visually were to take an hour and you were to take the 6 little slices of that and you would say, is this section continuous? Is this section continuous? Is this section discontinuous? The percentage of time of discontinuous patterns decreases as the baby gets older. So as age increases, continuous activity increases, and this means that the lower margin of the aEEG increases. And by 36 weeks, we only see discontinuous patterns in a healthy brain during that quiet sleep. So that non-REM sleep. Otherwise, we know that the continuous background is either REM sleep or wakefulness, and that at this point with aEEG, we cannot tell the difference. But what we can see is after babies hit that maturation point is that anytime they're in discontinuous, it should be because they're in a deep sleep. So the other thing to remember is that this alternation in pattern, this alternation in voltage begins to disappear around 42 weeks, and it is gone completely and replaced with a different feature of EEG sleep by about 46 weeks. So if you're using aEEG on a 5-week-old term infant who has NAS, you may not see sleep-wake cycling. And this may not be because he is not sleeping or having any EEG evidence of sleep. So it's important to know that this very interesting, beautiful sleep-wake patterns goes away. It's a developmental stage, and it goes away as the brain changes in those first weeks postnatal for the term baby. And it goes away, and we don't see it. And this is why aEEG, technically, the original aEEG devices were for babies up to 45 weeks. This is what the FDA clearance is in the US, 45 weeks. So when we begin to use it in older patients, it's because the aEEG tracing changes so much. The brain matures so much. The voltages are so much more continuous that all you end up with is a very, very, very skinny band all above 10. And it becomes, once you're above 10, it becomes almost impossible to really see these variations. We see very minor variations, but the pattern looks very odd when we're above that threshold. So when we're thinking about sleep-wake cycling, so for these kiddos who are still having alternating patterns, we can classify it as either mature, immature, or absent. And for me, the easy way to call mature is about 1 cycle during sleep, about 1 cycle an hour. So if I'm looking at this pattern and it's, this tracing, it's about 3.5 hours, I like to see about 3. It's not an exact thing, but for me in my mind, I like to see about 1 an hour. If I don't, I start to look at other things. I start to say, were there other care practices? Is the baby on Q4 ad-lib feedings? Is the baby, having other issues? Did the baby have a procedure? Has he been interrupted? Is he trying to have cycling, but they're getting cut off? Are they happening and then there's 3 hours in between and then they're happening? I try to paint the picture around what I see. This is what I expect, about 1 every hour. If I don't see it, I then try to fill in the gaps of, is it age? Is it illness? Is it procedures? Is it, whatever other things might be going on? But this is the kind of, in my mind, the ideal of what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that normal background pattern with that sleep-wake cycling about once every hour. This is the 2-channel view or the right-left view. A lot of people like to look at sleep-wake cycling on the cross-cerebral view, which is absolutely fine too. I just have this, had to happen to have this very beautiful sleep-wake cycling here. So here's an example of kind of that higher voltage, but in a baby who's still having cycling. So you can kind of see, again, I love this right here, number 5, where this little marker is. This is on the cross-cerebral. Kind of going along, having a sleep cycle, and then some activity happened, and it was interrupted. And it was interrupted for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, almost 2 hours before the baby had a complete sleep cycle again. And then it's kind of going into a normal pattern of about 30 to 40 minutes on, 30 to 40 minutes off, 30 to 40 minutes on. So this meaning quiet sleep or deep sleep, quiet sleep, active sleep, and then quiet sleep. So you can see kind of beginning to get back into that pattern. And like I said, I usually look for 30 or 40 minutes. So remembering that these spaces between the lines are about 10 minutes. So 10, 20, 30, kind of coming in this way, 10, 20, 30, 10, 20, 30. So that's about what it's typical. And again, over here on the left side, we see beginning to have that sleep cycle, but definitely something interrupted. And luckily someone posted up here a mark, so we can probably go back and look at that. All right, so let's talk about that clue towards injury, because I think this is one of the really powerful parts of using aEEG with cooling, is that for this very specific population, we've learned that in addition to background patterns being powerful as predictors of outcome, we also know that the return or presence of sleep-wake cycling is also very, very powerful. So if we look at this particular graph, and probably many of you have seen this used in many presentations on cooling and aEEG, but just to orient you to it again, the babies the babies identified here in blue, so either as the open triangle, closed triangle, or stars, any of the blue were babies who were cooled. And this was in a period in which they were still randomizing babies to cooling or to normothermia. The babies in the red are all indicated by circles, open or closed circles, or red stars, and those are the normothermic babies. So these are babies who had good outcomes, normothermia, babies who had poor outcome, normothermia. These are the babies here who had hypothermia, but good outcomes, and hypothermia, poor outcomes. And then over here on this axis, we have the time to return of sleep-wake cycling in number of hours. And then this gray bar at the top is babies who never achieved sleep-wake cycling. So if we look at the normothermic babies, what we see is that the majority of babies with good outcomes reached their back to sleep-wake cycling by 36 hours, most of them 24. So for normothermia, we used to say the return of sleep-wake cycling, the return of a normal background pattern, 24 hours, good prognosis. You can see that there's a few outliers here, these 3 with normothermia who had later return and a good outcome. And then we have even these 2 way out here who never regained it but had a good outcome. So remember, when we were still first doing hypothermia trials, we didn't know if it was going to help. So we monitored a lot of babies, and we tried to choose the babies who had moderate to severe HIE. So these could have just been kids who just had a quick pickup, who looked kind of crappy to start with, but then turned around pretty fast, and they still had a good outcome. So then let's look at the normothermic babies who did not have a good outcome. We see one had a return of sleep-wake patterns by a little bit before 24 hours. We see here that we had 2 who returned before 48, or right around 48. 1 at 72, and the star is the babies who died. So he had a late recovery, but also passed away. And then you see here the ones who had a poor outcome, how many more had no return of sleep-wake cycling. So same thing over here, cooling babies. Let's do the good babies first. So we see that babies who had a good aEEG, look how many of them had a return of sleep-wake cycling and a good outcome by 72 hours. So this is where you start to say, okay, I am cooling this baby. I'm getting ready to start rewarming. Has he had returning of sleep-wake cycling? And if you're starting cooling and you start to see that, we see there are more babies in this 24 to 48 hours who have them, but all the way out here to the 72, and even through that, you know, depending on how slow you warm, you know, maybe that period of rewarming, you see that we have the majority of them having some return of sleep-wake cycling by 72 hours. Never getting sleep-wake cycling, only 2 who didn't get it but had a good outcome. And then we see all of the ones of hypothermic babies who did not have a good outcome all past 48 hours, and most of them never regaining sleep-wake cycling. So is it 100%, oh, there's no sleep-wake cycling, and okay, this baby's having bad outcome? No. But is it highly predictive? Yes. And so I think that's where we need to look at that. And the predictive value gets really high, like in the 97, 98. I can't remember exactly from the paper, but it's a very high predictive value. The Massaro group out of DC Children's also looked at that, and again, looking at death or adverse outcome, number of cases with aEEG, sleep-wake cycling, days of life, and you can see that if they had death or adverse outcome by day of life 4, you would start to see some of the babies beginning to have sleep-wake cycling. So the ones that have a good outcome, that's the no list. The way they did this table is kind of like backwards in my brain, but no death or no adverse outcomes. You see that the babies back here are on day of life 1, beginning to have sleep-wake cycling. A bigger proportion here on day 2, even bigger proportion by day 3, and even looking at day 4 at the completion of cooling, and that first 24 hours post-cooling. Those babies who had no bad outcomes are the babies who continue to have sleep-wake cycling. So you can see that the progression and its stacking effect there. So another just kind of validation that looking at sleep-wake cycling can give us some really great clues for that particular population. So that's really all that I prepared to chat about. Anybody have any comments or questions, concerns, ideas pop from that? Please feel free to either chat in or you may unmute yourself, whatever you'd like to do. Oops. See if I can get the chat. So Dr. Teja, you're asking, how do sleep-wake cycles persist into childhood? Meaning that if the child had sleep-wake cycles interrupted during neonatal period, do they have issues in childhood? Or do you mean like what's the predictive value for other kinds of brain disorders? So, I mean, I can just kind of generally comment, like there are a few studies that have looked at, specific populations. So babies with SGA specifically, that, those babies tend to have poorer outcomes. So I think what sleep-wake cycling is a clue to is whether or not the brain has organized itself to do the things that babies need to do. Babies need REM sleep in order to have neurodevelopment. Synaptogenesis happens during sleep. So when we have disrupted sleep patterns in the neonatal period, we're disrupting the organization of the brain literally for life. So there are things that happen during sleep that need to happen for development. So when we don't have that happen, we see issues persisting into childhood with organization of the brain and other kinds of neurocognitive issues. But not necessarily always manifesting as continued sleep issues from what I've read. But they're definitely an interesting question, but mostly just saying sleep's important for neurogenesis, synaptogenesis, and organization, and what we see are true changes in the brain morphology and function, and that results in other issues in childhood and adulthood too. Even for us to not have interrupted sleep or lack of sleep, even into adulthood, sleep is such a restorative thing that if we don't get the sleep we need, we cannot function the same. And as we get older, the less we can function. I mean, probably, you know, in our 20s, all of us could, you know, be out all night and study all day and still do well on tests. And believe me, now I don't think that that's anything possible for me. So I think it's such sleeping is so important, and we just, I think, undervalue it. Think that we can, you know, sleep when we're dead, right? But, yeah, so the question is, in preterm babies, sleep-wake cycles develops with growth, so how can we use it predictably in childhood? Again, this is where aEEG is not the tool. And aEEG and, you know, sleep studies and other kinds of things can be helpful, but really with aEEG, it's really these early patterns that we can say, you know, they're present, they're maturing, they're disorganized, they're interrupted, or they're absent. And we can just look at that. So certainly the EEG literature, there is much more beyond the scope of what I've looked at as far as, you know, really other kinds of sleep-wake cycling. There's another great question here. So when in sleep-wake cycle would you do the cares if you had an aEEG on? This is a great question, and Lena Helster-Westus has looked at this. Also, you know, some nurses have looked into this as whether or not we can use aEEG to guide our care. I think my bias, and I don't know that it's maybe all that scientific, my bias would be to wait for a deep sleep cycle to be complete. So you saw how the sleep cycles, that one slide, here I'll go backwards, just to kind of refer to it. So you can see that the baby was either awake, likely in this particular slide was probably in the thin part, right? That's the REM sleep, or the or maybe awake, right? So when it's thin and continuous, that's the REM, active sleep, and then deep sleep, quiet sleep. So again, I think using aEEG, it's not a standalone tool. aEEG is a complementary tool. We use it in combination with the rest of our assessments. So I make the assumption here that someone interrupted this baby's sleep-wake cycle. So what is that something? Maybe the baby decided to have an ABD, right? Like he was in a deep sleep cycle, his breathing pattern changed, he got himself in a very relaxed state, and he closed off his, you know, obstructive airway, and he had an ABD and someone saved his life, right? Maybe that's what happened. Maybe an ABD so bad he had CPR for the next hour, who knows, right? So it's easy to judge, I think. I make the assumption that someone interrupted him, but maybe the baby did something that then created a spiral effect. So I think what we know is that in that deep sleep, quiet sleep, we call that, you know, that's the thing we always say to families, like when the baby's asleep, the brain is, you know, regenerating and growing and doing all these things. We know that they need to go through these cycles. I think my bias is to not interrupt a deep sleep cycle, and that I kind of have a feeling that, you know, it should be them going through that. So again, I don't know that it's been proven. I'm sure it's not been proven. I think it's my opinion. But I think that there are probably some decent rationale for it. I could probably dig the science, but I think that would be what I would say. And if you knew the baby had already had 2 deep sleep cycles and was kind of in a third, we know that we tend to wake them every 2 to 3 hours. But I think I would kind of even observe them in that kind of continuous spot here and see if they're having more movements or, you know, kind of any pre-arousal behaviors, and then begin with some hands-on to touch them, see if you could stimulate them gently, and see if you could rouse them, then continuing out of that sleeping state into kind of a more drowsy state and kind of going through the typical arousal pattern, you know, gently, of course. Let's see. I look at nursing documentation on sleep, which babies. I look at nursing sorry, Dr. Chagey, I'm not understanding that one. So if deep sleep is only 20 to 30, then in reality, you don't have to wait too long before you move out of it. Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So just to reconfirm, exactly, yeah. So if you already see they're 20 minutes in, you know, there's probably in the next 5-10 minutes, they're going to be transitioning. If they have a nice mature sleep cycle in about 5-10 minutes, they should be transitioning into a more active sleep or potentially into their own arousal for wakefulness. So you're looking at nursing documentation for NAS babies on their duration of sleep in 24 hours. So like for doing Finnegan scorings, and which babies should we do aEEG? My bias for NAS babies is all babies with NAS should be monitored with aEEG. There's a couple studies that are looking at that. One in California, one in Wisconsin, one in Ohio. Kind of individuals are looking at that. I think we need to organize a bit more around that so we can do that. But certainly babies with NAS have, the studies I've seen do have disrupted sleep-wake cycling. So what does it mean in the long term? I don't think we know. Oh gosh, Anne, so how long should we wait before stimulating? Oh gosh, well, you know, I was just making up a commentary on why someone maybe would have interrupted a baby's sleep-wake cycling. So this is a good question, right? We call apnea, so we call apnea anything, you know, the cessation of breath for 20 seconds or more. But then remember aEEG, only one line of aEEG is made every 15 seconds. Right? So a 20-second apneic period pretty much is going to go through, if you watch my little pointer, is going to occur during this little line and midway through this little line, right? So remember, every 15 seconds is a single brush stroke on the aEEG. So apnea in and of itself, right, is going to be, I mean, if it's a short apnea, it's going to be even a, well, I think most of us probably wouldn't wait too long, right? But I'm just saying it would be extremely difficult to pick up an apnea on aEEG from a neurological point of view because it's going to be so short. Now, whether or not that A turned into a B and a D, which then necessitated you as this bedside provider to go in and do something, you know, I think that's where I've seen, you know, in enough aEEGs at this point to see, oh, this baby had an ABD and I've seen a sleep cycle be interrupted. But there are other reasons we interrupt babies, right? This is somebody coming in to do a lab or someone coming in to get an x-ray because it's the time or, you know, so there's lots of reasons that sleep cycles can be interrupted by care providing. I just think ABD might be an interesting one. And I hope that answered what you were saying, Anne. So I don't know that we can wait on aEEG to see changes. I don't think we actually can see them. Great questions. Anything else? Well, thanks everybody for joining today and fun discussion on that and great points by all of you. So let me just kind of go back to the last slide, which is the date for so for April, I tried to find a Monday in April that I could do this. I've never missed a Monday and I don't even know, like 5 years. So I'm not gonna miss a month because that's usually what I have to do. But let's not miss a month, but I'm gonna just switch the date to Friday, April 20th. I'm also doing, if you haven't seen it, a developmental care book club, which is also free to do the discussion. And I have already posted up the reading for next month. So developmental care book club will be 7 a.m. Pacific. And then the aEEG Q&A call will be 8 a.m. Pacific. So if you're interested in that, you can shoot me an email or a message and be happy to send you information. I'll also just give you my website is synapsecare.com. And on synapsecare.com, there is, oops, sorry, I just got to one person. On the website, there's a link for the Developmental Care Book Club, so if you want to look that up, you can. And we'll be doing that on the same day, and I'll probably continue that pattern just because I tend to know I'm going to be near internet when I do my aEEG call, so I just figured it would be a good day to do those together. So anyways, I invite you to be a part of that as well if that's interesting to you or any of your team. And I'm leaving for Munich tonight, and I'll be teaching at an aEEG conference there, so I'll be posting things up on our Facebook group and on our page and on LinkedIn, so hopefully I can show you some sights of Munich. So hope you guys all have a great rest of the month, and I'll talk to you in a few weeks.